We're going to use the context of the Reagan administration to set the stage for the emergence of hip-hop culture in the United States, especially in the 1980s. Keep in mind that abroad, the Reagan administration is putting forward this incredibly aggressive anti-communist in name, at least hypothetically, foreign policy, which is increasingly violent and militaristic in terms of backing military dictatorships, especially in Latin America, but also across the world, and including the dramatic increase in funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Of course, domestically, the Reagan administration is continuing much of the law and order regime of the Nixon administration, although this does set the stage for the so-called war on drugs, which continues through the Bush and Clinton eras and is solidified by the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which is often pointed towards for the dramatic increase of the prison population in the United States. From the perspective of individuals who are tied to the early origins of the hip-hop movement, and especially the historian of hip-hop, Jeffrey Chang, the social context of the 1980s in New York City is particularly important for the early stages of the development of this musical genre. The most influential musical genre to come out of the United States since the jazz era worldwide, by the way. The phrase, "the Bronx is burning," is often cited as a sort of mantra that was indicative of the social context of the borough in the 1980s, where hip-hop emerged out of this merger between dance hall music from reggae and Jamaica and Kingston and the culture of the Bronx. The phrase itself refers to this circumstance where New York real estate families, and keep in mind that New York real estate families are notoriously corrupt and notoriously prejudiced, would do things like take out insurance policies on apartment buildings in the Bronx, and then intentionally torch the buildings and collect the insurance money. This got to such a pervasive sort of point during the course of the 1980s that quite famously, supposedly at a baseball stadium, you have these panorama shots where the camera sweeps across the crowd and then goes up so that you can see the city skyline. It says to the crowd and those viewing at home across the country, "There it is, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." Of course, while somewhat mythical in its context, the phrase "the Bronx is burning" is connected to a historical trajectory in which 300,000 people left the borough during the course of a decade. During the same period, Section 8 project housing, which was subsidized by federal funds, was cut substantially from HUD's budget under the Reagan administration, and Section 8 was replaced by local city-subsidized project housing. There was also low-level petty violent crime that was systemic and police brutality that was systemic. And local cultures, of course, if you could not be protected by the police, you would turn to other forms of local protection, and particularly urban youth formed a series of gang networks to protect one another against one another and also against the brutality of the police. More broadly, of course, hip-hop in this context was born from the likes of DJ Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash. Also important were the notion of rent parties, where DJs would get together and have a party for a specific family or group of families and use the party to raise their rent funds for the coming months. Over the course of the early 1980s, hip-hop became an incredibly popular genre, not just in the Bronx, but then also in Brooklyn, and quickly spread down the East Coast and across the country to the West Coast, as well as by the early 1980s to the banlieue of Paris and also the streets of Tokyo. So across the Atlantic and the Pacific within just a year. Moving forward here, please take note of any points that you find surprising from this context.